Okay, so just a second. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to the Risk Institute online seminars. My name is Kaori and I'm a PhD student at Management School. I'll be helping out with the organization of these seminars. So nice to meet you all. So today I'm pleased to introduce you to Dr. Dominic Balog-Way, who will give us a talk entitled The Evolving Field of Risk Communication. Where are we now and where are we going? So the presentation will be around 45 minutes, followed by 20 minutes of Q&A. So please, could you make sure your microphones are muted? And if you'd like to leave any questions in the chat, feel free to do so. But before we begin, I'd like to make a few announcements. So here is the schedule for the Risk Institute online seminar for the coming few weeks. So next week we'll have Dr. Dalal Al-Rajesh on the 29th of June at 12 p.m. And the week after we have the Institute's alumni, Dr. Silva Tolo, presenting a talk about the current challenges and the future solutions for the system safety analysis. And this is going to be a hybrid event, so it will be nice to see some of you in person. And the week after, we'll have the Dr. Christian Schilling, who will give us a talk about a gentle introduction to reachability analysis for dynamical systems. And then on the 19th of July, we have Mr. David Ropik at 3 p.m. So let me introduce you to today's speaker, Dr. Dominic Balog-Way. So he is a postdoctoral research associate in the Department of Communication at Cornell University. His interdisciplinary research examines the assessment, management, and the communication of risks to public health and the environment, working internationally and across sectors ranging from environmental protection and food safety to pharmaceuticals and public health. Dominic strives to improve public policy through evidence-informed risk management and strategic benefit risk communication. He is currently working on projects regarding the use of lead ammunition for hunting, infectious marine diseases, and deep geothermal energy. Throughout his career, he has advised and worked closely with state, national, and international government, as well as business advocacy groups and academics. So I'll now pass you to Dominic. And so if you could start sharing your screen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kaori. That's great. Thank you for the introduction. So I see that because Scott said it's a beautiful day in Liverpool today, so there are only a few people who have joined, which is absolutely fine. But I wonder if it would be possible, because there are only a few of us, would those that have joined be able to introduce themselves, just to say hi and then perhaps what they do? Would that be possible?
Hi, yes, I'm Connell Brown. I'm one of Scott's PhD students, and I'm researching uncertainty when we analyse text documents. And it's a lovely day, yes, and I'm sat in the garden under a parasol.
Good for you.
a good place for a Zoom meeting.
Absolutely.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Hello, I'm Daniel. I'm not from Liverpool. I'm actually from Czech Republic. And I've met Scott and his research team in several conferences. And myself, I'm working in reliability analysis. So I'd like to follow the work of Liverpool and hope to apply for my project, which is analysis of electric networks now.
Thanks, Daniel. Good to have you here. Great. So yeah, that's nice, because I think there are only a few of us, and I see a few other people are joining the room as well. And so rather than give a more formal presentation, I think it'd be easier if I walk through the slides and we can be a bit more informal, and I'm happy if you have questions as we go along to jump in. So the first thing I want to say is that this talk is an evolution in my own thinking on risk communication over the last few years. The title is The Evolving Field of Risk Communication. Where are we now and where are we going? And a lot of this talk now is a reflection on the field and some of my thoughts on some things that are going well and some things that perhaps could be improved. I'm at Cornell University in America, in West New York State. Which is, I was talking earlier with the others, which is not the same as upstate New York, which is outside New York City, but we're right on the west side of the state. I have a British accent because I am British. I was originally from London, and I did my PhD at King's College London on risk communication management and assessment. So to give you an idea of what I want to talk about today, I'm going to provide a selective overview of the contemporary field of risk communication, which is particularly relevant for those that may be unfamiliar with the field and especially the recent developments. This is based on a paper that I wrote with Catherine McComas, who is well known in the SRA risk communication community, and John Besley. Both of those two are past editors at the Journal for Risk Analysis in Risk Communication. Then after giving an overview, I'm going to discuss where I think we could or should go next, and then conclude with an open discussion. I'd really like to get your thoughts. I'd like to get your reflections and questions on where we're going next. So this word cloud was something we produced for the paper to get the paper started. It's a very simple idea, but basically we took every keyword from the Journal of Risk Analysis for papers that we believed were about risk communication. And you can see here, the redder and larger the words, the more they came up. And you see right in the middle of the field, we have risk perception, which is unsurprising if you know the history of risk communication. I just think it's interesting just to sort of put those words up there to get an idea of what the field of risk communication, at least in the Journal of Risk Analysis tradition, thinks about a lot when we look at risk communication. So some of the issues that I'm sure many here are familiar with, risks like flooding, nuclear power, nanotechnology to a lesser extent, and then concepts like decision-making, uncertainty, heuristics, etc. All of these we will touch on. So I'm sure all of you have a good idea on what you refer to in terms of risk communication. I think it's good to be clear about what I mean. So I see risk communication as probably the best definition I've come across so far is from Catherine McComas from 2006, which is an iterative process among scientists and non-scientists about risk assessment, risk characterization, risk management, and risk policy. So it includes both purposeful and unintentional messages about risk, is multi-directional, and that second point I think is absolutely key. Risk communication is not a one-way process of simply transferring information to an audience, but it involves multiple directions. It encompasses verbal and non-verbal cues. We often don't speak about verbal cues, such as, for example, if you think of Boris Johnson during the COVID-19 pandemic, right? When he was up on stage with his yellow hazard warning sign below, how he reacted, how he spoke really impacted how people thought about the risk, especially in the early days of the pandemic. So just an example of those two types. It also occurs at the personal, group, organizational, community, and societal levels. The field and the research I do goes across many different hazards and many different types of risks. So, and it's interdisciplinary as well. So there are many different fields ranging from, I'm originally a geographer, which is perhaps surprising to some. And so is my colleague, Ragnar Lofsted, who I was a supervisor of my PhD. He's based in the Department of Geography. But there's also many others like psychology, anthropology, and other social sciences, including the communication sciences. And this just gives an idea of some of the areas that I've worked in before and some of the areas I think that make up the field of risk communication. And another thing I think it's good to do to make clear up front is, why is it that we communicate about risk in the first place? And there are multiple different ideas about why we communicate about risk. One set of arguments are normative, The idea here is that there isn't necessarily a desired end result to risk communication. It's a good thing to do. It's the right thing to do in a democracy to reduce information asymmetries and to make sure that people are knowledgeable and aware of risks to them and their health and happiness. There are instrumental goals, which are often talked about when we refer to regulatory agencies, when we refer to policymakers who are trying to deal with a risk. So risk communication here is viewed as a tool or a resource to help achieve desired results. And those results can vary substantially depending on the area. And then a third one, which is connected to both normative and instrumental ideas, is substantive. So the idea here is that multi-way risk communication, so not just top-down, but multi-way risk communication, where you actually listen to your audiences, that can generate new insights and improvements in the quality of knowledge available to risk managers, to decision makers, by opening up the framing and evaluation of decisions. So a good example of that might be Twitter, right? So today, Twitter is used to gain new information about risks, so that decision makers maybe able to use that effectively for understanding the risks, for understanding their audiences as well. So again, multi-way, two-way decision making. Of course, we'll get into it later, but social media has many negative aspects. But that's just one perhaps opportunity or positive aspect that we can take from new media technologies. So for this first bit on the where are we now part, the review paper that I conducted with Catherine and John, we split the paper into three main areas after sort of conceptualizing the field. So the first are the audiences. So these are the various intended message recipients, messengers, the individuals, groups, and organizations purposefully engaging in risk communication. And the reason I've highlighted purposefully here is because risk is communicated by many of us all the time, as I mentioned before, in groups, in individuals, with our friends, with our family. But here, the work I've done is much more pragmatic, much more around how do regulators communicate, how do risk managers communicate about risk, and others. And the third aspect is message attributes. So these are the qualities and inherent characteristics of verbal, written, and recorded communication. So the idea here is not that this is all encompassing. These aren't the three main categories of risk communication. There are different ways you can, I had a professor once, who I worked very closely with, who says, how do you cut up the cake? And this is just how I've cut up the cake in this presentation. I find, for me, logically, it's one of the easiest ways to put the research into different buckets. So to start with, audiences. And so this is at the bottom, always begin by listening to your audiences. And that's something I tell whenever I give presentations to regulators. I work with a lot of regulators in Europe and in America, and my research looks across the Atlantic a lot. So you'll hear that coming up in this presentation. But always begin by listening to audiences, I think, is the key thing with risk communication and the origins of contemporary risk communication research. So first of all, I'm sure you'll all be very familiar with risk perception research. It is, perhaps you could argue, the foundations of contemporary risk communication. The main idea is that messages, risk communication messages, are filtered through the receiving audience's own selective lenses. And risk perceptions are informed by technical, yes, this is often left out, audiences do receive scientific technical information that does inform their decision-making. But the risk perception research and risk communication research more broadly shows that there are also fundamentally important social, cultural, and psychological factors that influence how we respond to risks, to risky activities, to different hazards. And there's an enormous amount of research on these different areas that is summarized in the paper. And to note that this research was preceded by fundamental research on bias and heuristics, which again, people are much more aware of this research than they were back in about a decade ago. I would say blossomed in many different areas, especially with its applications to policy. But a lot of risk perception research comes from bias and heuristics research, which is why it's unsurprising that a number of the major names or most prominent names in risk communication were students of those professors, of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. For example, Baruch Fischoff and Paul Slovic, who are key researchers and who are sort of founders of risk perception research, at least the psychological dimensions, were their students. And the idea behind risk perception research, you can see here, this is some of the earlier research on risk perception, was that you can characterize different technologies. And so this was much more about the characteristics of different technologies. And people would respond to them in terms of how they perceive them, how risky they saw them. So technologies or risks that were perceived as more natural than technological were seen as less risky. And the same goes for all the others I have on the screen here. So risks that are voluntary are seen as less risky than involuntary. Same with familiar versus unfamiliar risks, and ones where you're more in control versus less in control. And you can see on the images there some of the examples. And this is interesting because I presented this slide a couple of months ago, sort of near the beginning of the war in Ukraine. And I said there that one of this research, what they found in the early days was that if you bring together all of these different factors, natural, voluntary, familiar, more or less control, using a factor analysis, you can bring it onto two main dimensions in terms of how we perceive risk from a psychological perspective. And one of the biggest influences of risk is whether it's which is seen as dreadful or not. So you think about nuclear war and nuclear power. And I think that's really easy to communicate these days with the current environment, the current geopolitical situation. And so in nuclear power, traditionally, not so much anymore, but traditionally was seen as a dread risk associated with radiation. And then the second main factor was how unknown, how uncertain we are about the risk. And so you think back to, again, the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, Paul Slovic said that COVID-19 hits all the hot buttons that lead to higher perceptions of risk. And I think that was definitely true. It's obviously changed over time. We can talk later about why that might be. But it's definitely because it was unknown. We didn't know what the mortality rate was for COVID-19. We didn't know quite how it spread. And we didn't know its seasonal effects. We didn't know many things about it. And so these two factors, dread and unknown risk, have been very important. So in terms of risk communication, so I focus less on risk perception in terms of the research I do. I think more about, well, how might we use that risk perception research usefully to improve the effectiveness of risk communication? Well, the earlier days of risk communication, and this is still done in many occasions at the state, local, federal level, the supranational EU level, where risk perception research is used to inform a one-way deficit model of communication. So the idea here is that risk communication is treated as the outcome of objective expert risk assessments. So that is the authority on risk. Lay perspectives are considered subjective and irrational. And the idea is that we want to make people less irrational, something I very much disagree with the use of the word irrational. And it also seeks to align these lay perspectives with those of the experts. So the idea is that if people just had technical knowledge of these issues, they would be able to respond and adopt the behaviors risk managers might be recommending. So for example, food safety communicators, someone who's a regulatory authority like FEMA in the US who's trying to encourage evacuations. If people just understood the risk, then they would adopt the behavior and not take into account social, cultural, psychological factors, such as the ones I just talked about, that influence people's perception and understanding of risk. But this has moved very much in the literature and slowly across different authorities, regulatory authorities, to more of a multi-way engagement model. So the idea here is that risk judgments are not limited to technical risk assessments. It recognizes those social, cultural, and psychological influences on risk, and particularly emphasizes engagement through dialogue and deliberation. So again, this multi-way, two-way model of understanding risk communication. So in the review we did, we looked at a number of the major recent developments. So one of them is towards personal factors. So gender, race, age, and political orientation. A second major development has been around the concept of motivated reasoning. It's the idea that individual cultural values and ideology may cause them to respond based on a salient identity. So the idea here is bringing in culture much more to people's decision-making. That one of the main driving forces behind this research was the understanding that in America in particular, there's a big, trying to think carefully about my words, a big rift between Democrats and Republicans in America. that everyone is aware of now. And the idea was, how can it be with something like climate change that you can have highly informed and intelligent Democrats and Republicans who then differ on climate change and our responses to climate change, and even whether it exists. And the idea, and one of the ideas is around motivated reasoning, that one's values, ideologies is perhaps a bigger driver of their risk perceptions and responses to risk. And another one is reactance, which again, it seems to be more relevant than ever before, which is that some persuasive messages may irritate audiences, cause them to react, e.g. by, for example, by resisting recommended behaviors. And this is something we see a lot in teenagers. If you imagine a teenager, right, is asked to do something they don't want to do, and a parent says to them, hey, can you go and do this? They may, can you not do that? Or can you go and do this? They may react by doing the absolute opposite behavior. I don't want you to go out and drink alcohol. Well, they go out, that's exactly what I'm going to do. Or you don't want to do X, Y, and Z. And so that's the idea of reactance. But it works also not just for teenagers. It's much easier to explain it in terms of teenagers. But you can think of many other examples where people say, well, the message is irritating me, the message is frustrating. It may stop me from what I believe is a freedom for myself. And therefore, I'm going to resist by doing the opposite of what's recommended, regardless of the risk. So the second main bucket, the second main area of research we looked at was on messengers. And in particular, trust building activities can enable organizations to get out in front and stay ahead of problems. And this was a quote I got from Baruch Fishoff in a report when I was doing research in the earlier days of COVID-19 around how we might respond to these issues. And the idea there, and I think in many countries, this has been very unsuccessful in terms of trust building activities. But if organizations are able to build trust, to maintain trust, to provide a reason for audiences to place their trust in them, to be trustworthy, then that can help immensely in terms of risk communication. So in terms of messengers, the one main area is trust. Plays a central role in virtually every context. And the last decade or so was bookended by two major papers I highly recommend, one by Timothy Earle from 2010, and the other by Michael Siegrist from 2019. Both of those are in the journal Risk Analysis. Trust is very important when when knowledge of a hazard, activity, or technology is low. So what is the main function of trust? Why is it we talk about trust so much? Why is it so important? One of the main arguments is that the main function of trust is to reduce complexity in society. We couldn't possibly know all of the information we need to make a fully informed decision about every hazard, activity, technology that's out there and we deal with in our complicated contemporary lives. And so the idea here is that we need to, at times, and we do all the time, trust others with managing technology, with informing us about what to do. And so trust is vitally important, especially when people really don't know that much about the technology. And audiences, therefore, they rely on trustworthy sources to help inform risk judgments, preferences, and choices. And so some of the major debates at the moment is that there's been a shift in some of the sources that individuals are placing their trust in. I don't believe, in my opinion, trust hasn't evaporated, hasn't gone away. It's just people have changed where they put their trust, because we couldn't possibly verify every single source and everything we need to make all of our decisions we make in our complicated lives. And this has moved away in some regards from some of the traditional organizations. So for example, the CDC in America that manages viruses, that manages essentially COVID-19 pandemic advice, was one of the main areas it was working on over the last couple of years. And because of a number of things that are happening with the Trump organization, there were accusations of CDC being politicized, that I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, I was referring people to the CDC. You should listen to the CDC, and I still would. But there were times when people said, well, they don't seem as trustworthy to me. They seem politicized. Are they really a reliable source of information? So people started moving to other areas of trust. So more like their interpersonal relationships, or basing it on what they believe themselves. So at the bottom here, this just summarizes some of the work on COVID-19 and trust. And we can see that trust, there are surveys, there is other forms of qualitative and quantitative research that show that trust can influence the perceived disease severity. It can influence perceived virus transmissibility. It can influence, as I was mentioned before, where people seek information from and their behavior and how much information they seek. And also, perhaps most importantly, their willingness to adopt different interventions, whether that be wearing masks or social distancing from each other. And so trust has been incredibly important. And the evidence on trust also shows that there are a number, I personally think trust fits in with almost all risk communication research. It's fundamental. But here are a number of ideas on how we might build trust or improve trustworthiness. So first of all, there's no simple one-size-fits-all solutions exist. Anyone that tells you that there's a simple solution to trust, I believe, is wrong. I think testing baseline levels of trust is very important. Research from Ragnar Lofsted back from 2004 and since then has shown that different countries have different levels of trust in their government and different organizations. And so regulators have to test to see how much trust they have, and that will influence the approach they might take. For example, Nordic countries, especially Sweden, the public generally have much higher levels of trust in their government. Again, as you can see in the COVID-19 pandemic with how the Swedish public responded to their government's approach. Another thing is that to develop long-term trusted relationship with key actors, so make friends with journalists and do that well in advance. Create connections with influential individuals and groups that are trusted within communities, for example, religious organizations where appropriate, or other groups. I would recommend that regulatory authorities build baseline and surge capacities. So that means making sure you have trained risk communication messengers working for you. And then also engage audiences in meaning multi-way dialogue, something we mentioned before. Another area is on social media. So this is a quote from Dr. Marcus Mayorga. I really liked this article when I was doing the research for the paper. And there's one part where they say, well, we are awash with information, but are losing ground in our ability to separate fact from opinion. This is in part due to the sheer volume of information that comes at us during a 24/7 news cycle and the many conversations we have over social media. So obviously new social media, especially since around 2015, have had a tremendous impact on trust and the risk communication and information environment. There are a number of advantages of social media, as I mentioned earlier. There are new opportunities for risk communicators, but also the main thing a lot of people have focused on, and where there's been a lot of work in the literature now, is on the challenges of social media. So one thing is one issue is there's been a lot of confusion over what do we mean by different types of misinformation, malinformation, disinformation. On the left here, I've just given a very basic understanding, which is misinformation is generally false information shared without intent to harm, malinformation, accurate information taken out of context with intent to harm, and disinformation, so knowingly false information shared with intent to harm. And so you can see that it's more complicated than just saying fake news, right? So this is often spoken about. One issue for regulators is that they have to compete for attention with this near instantaneously distributed information. And research in the risk communication literature and science communication literature shows that false information spreads significantly farther, deeper, and more broadly, especially novel information that evokes certain emotions such as fear, disgust, and or surprise. And we've all seen this on social media, and we've seen the issue appears to be getting worse. One thing to note though with the empirical research is that audiences are not passive information recipients. Just because there's disinformation or malinformation online, it doesn't mean that people necessarily read information and react exactly as I don't know how to put it, to believe the information as it's presented. And there's also a crucial difference between audience exposure to information and their actual attitudes and behavior. I think if someone that's interested in this work, I would highly recommend Jonathan Haidt's recent research. He has some fantastic open research on this and a great article in The Atlantic, which was released recently, that I recommend people look towards. Another area for messengers is public engagement. And so the way I like to understand or conceptualize public engagement is from sort of low involvement public activities. So for example, filling in a survey, signing a petition, to really high involvement audience engagement and public engagement activities, such as audiences that attend meetings, so like town hall meetings, or go as far as becoming a board representative, so represented on a particular group. For example, the European Medicines Agency in the EU has patient representatives on its board. And the European Food Safety Authority also has representatives from different groups on its board. Public engagement is important, central to multi-way evidence-informed risk communication. And Nick Pigeon has done a tremendous amount of work in this area, saying that audiences are perfectly capable of debating complex issues when they have sufficient resources, time, and support. Valuable knowledge can also be attained before social controversies occur. And there was a lot of research done recently in risk analysis on nanotechnology and other emerging technologies to see, well, what issues should we be aware of before we put forward a new technology? And I think some of the most exciting areas here are in AI and in other emerging technologies, like robotics, for example. Excuse me. But the one issue with public engagement, I don't want to sound too pessimistic here because it is central, it's vitally important, but there have been persistent challenges over the years in terms of how we've managed to incorporate public participation into decision-making. So from the participants' perspective, increasing multi-way communication, increasing public engagement can result in participants feeling they have little meaningful influence, or they can become disenchanted with this backstage decision-making where a lot of decision makers, risk managers, it isn't this clean process of analyzing risks, of figuring out probabilities. There's a lot of bickering and there's a lot of muddling through decision-making. And that's not to say it's not that evidence-informed, evidence-based risk analysis is a problem or is weak in any way, but it's to say that humans and risk managers do have debates, do have disagreements as they go through. And sometimes you need to be able to ask, dumb questions, silly questions. For decision makers, if decision making is much more open and in the public domain and are much more available to criticism, well, they can feel pressurized. This can reduce their ability to discuss sensitive or complicated issues. And organizers, a massive issue, often require substantial multi-stakeholders commitments and capacities. For example, meaningful public engagement can be extremely expensive and difficult to do. So a few more issues at the bottom is that Henry Rossi has said before that some organizations have coped and adapted to public participation pressures rather than meaningfully bringing in the public into decision-making. And a couple of other authors have said at the bottom here that the promises of public participation maybe remain unfulfilled. Now, this again sounds very pessimistic and it highlights some of the problems, but I think some of the work by Nick Pigeon recently has really showed, and I would be happy to share those articles, I think they're excellent, has really shown that that public engagement is essential. It's not going away, and it's essential for participants, it's essential for decision makers, and it's essential for democratic decision making. And so this is definitely an area where there's a lot more research needed. The third main area are message attributes. And I will work through this section a little bit more quickly because I want to get on to discussing what we might look at for the future. So framing is central to all messages, and it can fundamentally alter risk issues by setting the context for risk perceptions and behaviors. So how a message is framed is vitally important, and it should draw relevant connections and have personal significance. At the bottom here, I have just one example of a frame. And this is a gain versus loss framing. So on the left, we have the doctor saying the operation has a 90% success rate. That sounds really reassuring to an audience. However, if you said that there's only a 10% chance of death, that's a totally different framing of different psychological framing, which can affect risk communication, affect responses to risk. Excuse me, got a bit of a cough. A second major area of research of the last 10 years has been to look at risk as feelings research, which recommends that we attend to the affective and emotional components of messages. When I spoke about risk perception before, we were talking a lot about the contextual factors around different hazards, activities, and technologies that can influence responses to risk. And here, the research really shows that people look to their positive and negative feelings to guide their evaluation of a technology. So how you might respond to, say, nuclear power. How do you feel when you think about nuclear power? How do you feel when you think about skiing? How do you feel when you think about smoking or any other type of risk? And these feelings serve as an important cue for people's benefit and risk judgments and decisions. And it's very natural. It can often be a very helpful way of assessing risk, but it can go wrong. And so a lot of researchers have looked more into specific discrete emotions, such as negative ones like fear, concern, and anger, and looking into research around fear appeals. Obviously, there are important questions around the ethics of appealing to people's fears when we're communicating about risk, but nevertheless, there's research in that area. And then positive emotions like happiness and amusement. Perhaps, one area which is developing quite quickly now is that in certain cases, using humor to communicate can be a particularly effective way of communicating. And another major area has been around uncertainty communication. So the idea here is that to what extent should we communicate uncertain risk information when we're communicating about risk? And there are two main sides of the debate. One is that we have to communicate about uncertainty. It's vitally important to our definition and understanding of risk and risk assessment. It's beneficial for trust because you're not hiding information. It can be beneficial for transparency as one of the arguments. It can improve the legitimacy of decision making and legitimacy of engagement. If you wanted true public engagement, then you'd have to be clear about what uncertainties there are in risk. But on the other side, it may be that, as some have argued, that communicating about uncertainty, it may do more harm than good. It may show that risk assessors, risk managers didn't really understand the risk issue all along. To what extent do the public understand and can they conceptualize different uncertainties? We don't deal with uncertainty particularly well, and it can suggest that a communicator or a manager doesn't know the issue that well. Personally, I somewhat reject both arguments here, and these are the four main reasons. So first of all, most of these arguments, people aren't actually really concerned about uncertainty communication per se, but the main concern is really about the current approaches adopted by certain practitioners. For example, the European Food Safety Authority have been criticized recently by Osman, for example, on the second line of this slide, because of their approach to uncertainty communication. Their arguments that they're not communicating about uncertainty that well, and it's confusing publics more. There are various different forms of uncertainty that must be recognized. So we can't just talk about uncertainty broadly. Anyone who knows anything about risk assessment knows that there are many different types. And as Anne Bostrom says, there are no clear-cut or simple solutions to uncertainty communication. And the effects of communicating uncertainty are strongly influenced by how information is communicated in the first place. And I think for me, that last point is the main aspect of it, which is that we shouldn't have a debate over whether we should or shouldn't communicate uncertain risk information, but it should be about how do we do that and when and in what ways, of course, and that's where evidence-informed risk communication and evaluation becomes so important. So I wanted to leave some time to talk about where the field might be going next. Before I do that, I'll quickly just mention, so where is the field now? So this is just a summary of what we've been talking about. So first of all, risk communication is a vibrant and growing interdisciplinary field. I've only just touched on some of the main areas that I think I've been particularly interesting over the last 10 years. And please, I refer to the paper if you want to dig in more to some of the areas that have appeared. There continues to be strong engagement with new events, emerging technology, risk communication channels, and hypotheses. There's no simple or dominant formula for risk communication that exists. So what that means is that we can't just, I had one colleague who used to be the head of the Health and Safety Executive and the European Food Safety Authority, And he said, we can't look for holy grails. We can't try and find that magic wand on how to communicate about risk more effectively. It needs to be a much more holistic approach with many different elements, as I've tried to set out in this presentation so far. Many concepts like trust and uncertainty are multidimensional. It's not just about trust. It's not just about uncertainty. There are many aspects of it. And very optimistically, positively, interdisciplinarity remains one of the field's greatest strengths. And this is partly why the Society of Risk Analysis is so important, in my opinion, to the field of risk communication. But where could or should the field go next? And I'd love to have a discussion about this to the extent that we have time. I would say, first of all, when we did our review, one thing that really came across is that there are a number of major challenges that persist in the risk communication area. I've just sketched out 3 of them here. So one of them, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, is disciplinary territorialism, which can impede progress. So by this, I mean that interdisciplinarity is not the norm in academia in general. And in fact, that's why the Society for Risk Analysis was created in the first place, to bring together different disciplines who ordinarily wouldn't have met. If you want to work towards tenure in the US, if you want to be promoted in department, if you are a postdoc and you want to be hired, you have to show your contribution to a particular discipline, but risk communication itself is multidisciplinary. So that can be a departmental aspect of the academic system. Journals, apart from some of the, obviously some journals are very interdisciplinary, but many cater to specific disciplines and expect certain methods and certain theories are cited and used. And also grant funding can often be disciplinary, although there are, again, of course, exceptions. Another major issue is that there remains this substantial gap between research and practice, or practice and research, depending on how you look at it, in terms of risk communication. We have this enormous abundance of risk communication research, but there have been a lot of academics, or a number of academics, who have lamented over the fact that a lot of this hasn't penetrated policy and practice. And so this was research done by Åsa Boholm in Sweden. She looked at 6 different regulatory agencies that deal with risks on a regular basis. And they found that all of these agencies had a little effort to explore the actual concerns of the public. So I talk about multi-way risk communication, the importance of that. But they found that this wasn't happening. And they found that there was very little critical reflection on risk communication science. Another angle is from the late and great Roger Kasperson, who wrote in a fantastic commentary back in 2014 that risk communication is replete with missed opportunities, missteps, and outright failures. Examples include radioactive waste disposal in the US and food safety issues around acrylamide, BPA, food colorings, not to mention how response to the COVID-19 pandemic. I think it's fair to say it was not evidence-based, it was not informed by the best risk communication, and it really poses a challenge to the field. So what are we going to do going forward? Like, what does the future of risk communication look like? My opinion is that we have an enormous body of research, and that risk communication is something that is for the future. It remains a relatively young field, especially if you compare it to other fields like chemistry or mathematics or other ones. Here are a few ideas on what I think we could do going forward. So the first one is, I think we should increase the number and scope of boundary organizations that connect academics with policymakers and practitioners. This is a proposal put forward by Baruch Fischoff a number of times over the last few years that I think could be extremely effective. That's something I've been working hard to do myself. We can talk about that more. I think we should investigate policy relevance as a core area of research in risk communication. In as much as we research risk communication, we should communicate how we communicate about our research, how we communicate about risk to different policymakers. There's some great work from researchers at University of Stirling, Paul Kearney, and then others at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, who I've worked with before, who I think have got some really interesting ideas in this area. And then the final thing for me is we need to help practitioners become more strategic in the new information environment. So I have about 10 minutes more worth of slides, but I don't want to necessarily use up all of our time. So I'm going to go through this, as I say, relatively quickly over the next 5 minutes to hopefully give us some time left over at the end. So this is something I've been working on in the last sort of year or so, and I've changed it as I've been going on through the last 4 or 5 presentations that I've given. And the idea here is, so, I argue that we should become more strategic. What do I mean by that? Or a strategic risk communicator is someone, for me, that prepares long before risk communication becomes urgent. So this is in contrast to an ad hoc risk communication, someone who prepares only for a specific purpose or event, like a food recall. So again, here, think of a regulatory authority. Strategic risk communicators are adaptive, flexible, and non-linear. And so this is, rather than just rigidly sticking to initial plan, one needs to be adaptable as you go through the risk communication process. I think risk communication should be evidence informed rather than relying on intuition and traditional practices, something we haven't seen as much recently. I think risk communicators should improve their knowledge of risk communication science, and they should view risk communication holistically. So if you look at the different areas, the different buckets I was referring to earlier, you can't just focus on audiences and psychological risk communication or risk perception research. You need to look at other areas of risk communication. This is what Lawrence Friedman said about it. He's a professor at King's College London, who I highly admire him and his book, A Strategy History. Having a strategy suggests an ability to look from the short term and the trivial, to view the long term and the essential, to address causes rather than symptoms, to see woods rather than trees. Without a strategy, facing up to any problem or striving for any objective would be considered negligent. And here, Lawrence really points to the idea that strategy is essential. There isn't a better approach. One important aspect of a strategy is choosing a goal, which is fundamentally important. This affects which activities you choose and what you can expect. If you think about risk communication, one of the main goals of risk communication is we want to improve the effectiveness of risk communication. But effectiveness refers to the degree to which we achieve a desired result, right? So say that again, effectiveness is the degree to which we achieve a desired result. And therefore, if we want to improve the effectiveness of risk communication, we need to know what that end result is, otherwise we won't know where we're going or what we're doing. I'll miss out the example here because I'd rather have more time to be able to talk. Another central pillar of the strategy is evaluation. So often risk communicators see evaluation as it's dismissed as unnecessary or too costly. And I have a lot of sympathy for this approach. If you spent your time working on a risk communication program, then you put a lot of energy and time and passion into creating that risk communication program. I can see exactly why you might be reluctant to evaluate whether it's gone well or not. If it's gone poorly, you might be at risk of being fired. So you have to be open to failure and open to altering your risk communication approaches. And I've done that before myself, and it is difficult. But even the best laid plans often go awry. Even if you bring in the best expertise, risk communication can go wrong. Faith, intuition, and anecdotes are no substitute for dispassionate evaluation. And there's now a lot of guidance on how to improve evaluation. And these are just 3 examples of what happens if you don't use evaluation. So a message telling teenagers not to smoke caused them to increase their intentions to smoke. College students drank more after hearing an explicit message telling them not to drink. So these are the unintended effects of risk communication that can boomerang and have the opposite effects of what one intended. And then we all know what happened with COVID-19, and Catherine and I have a paper on that. So as Baruch Fisher says, even the best science produces the best informed best guesses about how well messages will work. However, even these best guesses can miss the mark, meaning they must be evaluated to determine how good they are and how they can be improved. And then finally, with any strategy, and this is something that does come up a lot, is ethics. So some people say we shouldn't have a strategy because that's unethical, that if you have a strategy, you're essentially manipulating an audience into believing what the risk communicator wants. And I disagree with that strongly. But that does point to the fact that we need to think carefully about ethics and risk communication. Not all goals are desirable in all circumstances. For example, smoking versus nuclear power, the goals could be very different. The means does not necessarily justify the ends. We shouldn't lie to audience or manipulate them. Persuading someone is a different matter. And if we don't evaluate messages, that we can, as I mentioned in those 3 examples before, cause unintended effects. So quickly conclude to say, risk communication is a vibrant interdisciplinary academic field, but practice remains challenging in the modern world. One approach is to take an ad hoc, intuitive approach, but that can often fail or backfire. And we know that from decades of experience. I argue, and this is a paper I'm working on now, I argue that a strategic approach is the only meaningful alternative. And I will end with what Roger Kasperson said in 2014, risk communication deserves meaningful evaluation, long-term commitment, and as he put it very well, perseverance is not an easy thing to do. So with that, I'll stop the presentation and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Dominic, for the talk. It's very constructive review and suggestions. I was wondering if anyone in the audience have got comments or questions for Dominic.
I guess I do. You didn't mention many, but the examples of risk communication failing are there's all over. Really, sometimes dramatic. I have a friend who said at one point he was on some panel doing the state of Illinois, and he said at one point the lights went off and a gunshot rang out.
Oh wow!
The typically American scenario, I guess. Do you know of any success stories? I mean, are we just doomed to failure every single time?
Yeah, I think that the failures are more prominent than the success stories. I think there are a tremendous number of success stories. We as academics often focus on the failures and try to learn from the failures. I think we would do better. And I've talked to a few colleagues about this recently about how can we highlight some of the successes. It's hard to think on my toes about clear examples. I think what it really depends on is what you consider to be a success as well. And this is something that bogs down a lot of social scientists. I mean, one example could be, of course, it's been a very long time, but smoking. You know, smoking has, if the goal of smoking is to reduce the number of people that are smoking, well, that's certainly happened over many years. And you wouldn't necessarily say, oh, that's just risk communication. There's been many other efforts that have gone into reducing the risks of smoking, to reducing the number of people that smoke. But risk communication has certainly been part of that. How we, and I think that's something as well, which I didn't mention in the presentation, which is that risk communication is fundamentally connected to risk management. And I don't think it can't be done in isolation. I'm trying to think of other success stories. Yeah, there's a number of other success stories, and that they're very specific. But one is from a project that was done in Germany a number of years ago. And this was about, and I know in the context of what's going on now, this was about nuclear waste disposal. And this was a positive story. And what happened in this situation, there's a research paper I'm happy to share around, was the local government was trying to figure out where can they site this waste disposal facility. And everyone said, not in my backyard. We don't want this waste disposal facility near us. And so they didn't know what to do. So what they ended up doing, the risk communicators, the government officials, is they went to one town where there was a local artist who was very well trusted. And they sat down with the artist and they said, okay, well, what can we do to site this facility somewhere? And he said, and they sat down with him and explained the issues, explained why it was important, explained why it's something they needed to do. And he eventually said, yes, okay, you can site it in my town, so long as I'm able to design the building. And they said, okay, fine, do that. So they designed it, he designed it, and it was built and it was sited. It has ended up being one of the main attractions of the town. It's become an important feature. And that is an example of engaging with audiences. That's an example of working with trustworthy sources. That's an example of, I'd say, a risk communication success.
I think it's also an example of a payoff.
Of a payoff, did you say?
Yeah. I mean, he got to design it. Mm-hmm. I imagine that there was some money exchanged, was there not?
I don't know the answer to that. It's a good point. I should have a look at that. But the idea there was that I don't actually think there was a payoff there. I think the idea was he loved his town, and that he wanted to make sure that there wasn't an ugly building there, and it's something, you know, something that worked. But you know, you're right. Yeah, you're probably right to be skeptical. Yeah.
I mean, my friends tell me that risk analysis is really just a charade. That, you know, decisions at EPA and at CDC that are important decisions are really never made based on the results of risk analysis. It's always horse trading. I mean, that's the classical term for it. It's always really, and risk analyses are really just used as, you know, weapons or, you know, arguments, but really they're never determinative. And you know, I fear, as a professional risk analyst, that may be true, but I have no evidence to the contrary either, that, you know, it's not. I suppose the thing that shocked me in the pandemic risk communication effort wasn't that we didn't know how to risk communicate, because clearly we don't, but it seemed also that we didn't know how to estimate the risks either. We didn't know how to do the risk analysis, which was, you know, even more of a problem in a sense, because, you know, especially when some more data came in and people realized, oh, we made the wrong guess on this one matter, they were very reluctant to sort of express that fact and change their minds in a public way. And nobody can trust you if you're known to have this feature, you know.
Yeah, well, if we talk about the policymakers or government decision makers, I was on an informal group that was informing the International SAGE committee, right? And so there I was talking a lot about trust, and I was talking a lot about, you know, what should we do to improve trust? What should we do to communicate better? And this was in the sort of the summer 2020, so just sort of in the middle of the earlier stage of the pandemic. And I was surprised to see that the response we got was, well, we came up with a report. It was evidence-based. There were a number of us working on it, including me and Nick Pidgeon, Baruch Fischoff, Ragnar Lofsted, and the report never made it through the cabinet. It never made it through because it's not what they were interested in hearing about. And I wonder if the same is true in some areas of risk analysis, that we do know a lot more, and we have improved a lot more. It's not perfect art, it's not perfect science, but that there is this disengagement with policymaking to too large an extent, you know. So, you know, that's kind of why I sort of present it as a pessimistic versus optimistic outlook. You know, I'd rather be optimistic and wrong than pessimistic and right. And I think that's part of the work of an academic. It's part of our work to see how we can make those improvements, especially with engagement in policymaking and meaningful engagement. And, you know, not just around risk communication, around, you know, risk management, risk assessment. If you look at other areas, like, for example, pharmaceuticals, the European Medicines Agency, I would say, is very, you know, obviously there's questions around vaccines, there's questions around COVID-19, but it's very consistent with its approaches to analyzing pharmaceutical drugs, and it has a very rigorous approach in terms of its relationship with industry, etc. So, yeah, I think there are positive and negative examples, but maybe you have other thoughts, Scott. I don't know.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, I wish I knew more.
Do I have time for a question?
Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
Right. So thank you for a very interesting talk. I'm interested on your thoughts on fear appeals. I do a lot of work on dog bite prevention, and the dog experts and government seem to, and the media seem to want to use fear appeals a lot. You know, toddler mauled by dangerous dog, you know, all these attacks are happening.
Yeah.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on what might be the best approaches to
the
risks of dogs? Because a lot of people live with dogs quite happily, but there is an everyday risk that every dog can bite. So it's a really interesting one for people to get their heads around, how their beloved family member could actually really harm their child.
Yeah, I've done some work on dangerous dogs before myself, actually. And there's stuff with there's some work from the year, I think it's year 2000, by Christopher Hood and Henry Rothstein, where they one of their case studies is on dangerous dogs. So that was from Henry being from King's College London, Christopher being Oxford. So there's two things there. One, in terms of fear appeals, I have a real problem with fear appeals. I'm not really sure how you can use it in practice. And this happened again. I'm sorry for keep referring to COVID. It's been on my mind for so long. But at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, one thing the government wanted to do behind the scenes is they thought, we really want to scare people into being worried about the disease, right? And we want to scare people into having a vaccine. And that can result in reactance. People can get very upset about that. That was one of the recent developments that we've been looking at, which is if you irritate people, if you try and scare them, they may respond by doing the opposite behavior of what you intended. So I haven't seen a practical use of fear appeals, and there are ethical questions around it. To what extent should we be scaring people into doing what we think is perhaps the right thing to do? Another angle on this for me is, I don't know if you've read also Boholm's work on the relational theory of risk. She has a really good section there where she provides an example around dangerous dogs. And there's a paper called, it's called The Relational Theory of Risk by her and Herb Kovelek in 2012. I recommend it. And what she says there is that, well, with dangerous dogs, it really depends how you construct the risk issue in the first place. So, what is the risk object? So what is the thing causing the risk, and what is the object at risk? And so it sounds, with your example, Carrie, it seems that one way of constructing it is to say the dog is the problem. The dog is the one who is biting people, and so the dog is the risk object, and people are the victims, right?
Yeah.
And another way of looking at it, to construct the issue differently, is to say, well, maybe it's the owner. Maybe the owner is the risk and the victim is the dog, because the dog doesn't want to go. Most dogs don't want to go around biting people.
Yeah.
They don't want to be dangerous. And you have many people who have relatively dangerous dogs, or dogs that are, more likely to bite. And so that really fundamentally changes the policy approach you take to dealing with a dangerous dog issue, right? So maybe this is stuff you've thought about a lot before, but how you construct that issue in the first place directly affects your communication approach and your management approach. Because if you think the problem is the dog's fault, the risk object is the dog, well, then you might be thinking about fear appeals. But if you think the problem is the owners, then fear appeals isn't necessarily the best thing. The best thing might be around education, training, and controls, perhaps on, I can't think of anything off the top of my head, perhaps it's not an area I looked at recently, but you might be thinking more in terms of very different approach, a different agency, perhaps altogether, dealing with the issue.
Yeah, no, that's similar to the thoughts that we were having. Like, I've worked a little closely with Royal Mail. So to them, the hazard is the dog. But when you live with a dog all day, every day, the hazard isn't the dog. The hazard is certain interactions you're having with that dog. So yeah, it changes depending on the context. And the interviews I've done with people about their risk perception is the dog is never to blame, unless it's a pit bull, then it's to blame. But normally it's not. If you know the dog, the victim is to blame. You did something wrong. If you don't know the dog very well, then it's the owner's fault.
Interesting. Yeah.
Interesting. Really fascinating.
Cool. Yeah, I think it's a great area, great study. It's one we think about less than we do many other areas. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
But one that I was thinking of while you were talking is about the trust. Obviously, everything is contingent on trust. Of course, the best way to gain trust is to be in the in group, I guess. Just
to be in the what in group, do you say? To
be in the in group of the person you're talking to. Or maybe I thought you could dose them with some oxytocin aerosol spray, maybe. I'm wondering I'm wondering if Joseph Biden could aerosolize oxytocin, just spray it into the Senate chamber, maybe.
Yes. I think that would slip more into the ethical issue area. But I mean, I know your example is almost comical, but I think it does highlight the ethics of risk communication, and again with fear appeals, right?
Sure.
I think one could take a serious point out of it, which is that we do an awful, I'm very positive about the risk communications. It's my field, is an area I'm very connected to. I'm also critical of it in many areas. But one issue I have is that we do an awful lot of research without necessarily thinking about how we might use that research in a practical way. So there's a ton of research on fear appeals now. To what extent can we use that research? Or is it just done because it's interesting, you know? And I'm not saying we shouldn't do fear appeals research, but, you know, to what extent should we do research on whether we should spray some oxytocin in President Biden's
well, haven't politicians not just done the research, but they've weaponized fear research, don't you think? I mean,
I think unsuccessfully to a large extent, but there are. I mean, that's one of the big debates around nudge at the moment, right?
Yeah.
This is the big thing in the UK, especially at the moment, which is a lot of policymakers see this as, oh, a really cheap way of influencing the public, so they can do what we think is appropriate. So I think, obviously, there's the practice, and then there's what we think we should do. You know, the ethics, what we ought to do. And I think that's something that we need to stop. We should talk about it more explicitly in the risk communication literature. I think it's often assumed by a lot of academics that people will do the right thing with research, that people will do, you know, we're creating a tremendous amount of research on how people think, how people behave, how they respond to different things. And so I think, you know, I mean, it's something, I'm writing a paper at the moment, which is partly why it's in my mind, but I think it's important. I think it's something we should consider more carefully, and it hasn't been considered carefully enough.
Yeah, I agree completely. It's actually quite worrying, your suggestion that, you know, you talk to the people in the, you know, well, your example of the artist who helped convince the town, and your earlier suggestion that you should talk to, you know, faith leaders, people in the church, to get them on board, because that is sort of a, I mean, it seems to me that's really the ethical problem, right? I mean, God knows that faith leaders have done some some manipulations in the past, and it's really, of course, you know, not what we think is the right answer,
right,
that should guide it, right? What we want to be the outcome is what that person, fully informed and aware of all the options, and in a sound mind and a sober consideration would choose. That's the right option. But of course, that's impossible to discern in many cases. And I don't think for a minute that either the church or the artist can really do that for us.
So that is one of the big traditional criticisms of risk communication research. And I agree with you with what you say there, which is that that's just the whole point, in my opinion, of multi-way risk communication research, where you engage audiences meaningfully. Obviously, it has to be meaningful, right? And a lot of the recommendations we gave to the UK government, they didn't take on that idea that we should first listen to audiences. They were thinking, well, how can we, you know, it's the question is, are you trying to achieve the goals of the risk manager and communicator, or are you trying to achieve the goals of your audience if they were in your position, right?
Yeah.
And that is where the key ethical component comes down. And I think it's perfectly reasonable to try and persuade an audience of something. You know, there are three main types of influence: persuasion, influence, and coercion. Persuasion, manipulation, and coercion. And manipulation, trying to manipulate someone, for example, by lying to them to convince them to do what you want them to do, is obviously terrible. That's unethical. Coercion, of course, it's the same. But persuading someone by engaging with them and listening back to what they say, to understand what the public want, to what the audiences may want from this risk issue, is fundamentally important. And I'm not trying to conclude here. I'm saying that it's a debate that needs to happen more. And especially, I mean, if you think about a sort of, in a utopic way, imagine we really did understand risk perception communication. We understood how everyone reacts to different types of risk. That's a pretty powerful knowledge to have. And that provides even more reason to engage with ethics and values, what people value differently. And you could go even further and say, well, every definition of risk includes some notion of value. So it's, you know, it might be it's a risk because it's a risk to something you value, right? It's a risk to your life, to your health, to your happiness, to your profits, for example. It would be a risk to almost anything, to a social object, like a statue, for example. So you know, when we talk about ethics, we talk about values, and that's embedded within our understanding of risk, and different people are going to value different things in different ways. Again, hence, although public engagement, you know, I was quite critical of it in the presentation, but that's why it's fundamentally important, because that's the only way to, you know, to get that normative engagement, to inform what you're doing from a normative perspective on how people perceive and understand risks, and not just to see people as, oh, well, you don't see it in the technical way, therefore you're irrational. People may have very legitimate reasons why they disagree with a particular risk issue. You know, I think Carrie's example of the dogs provides some of that as well. Yeah.
Thanks,
I think it's a good
very much.
discussion as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, anything else? I've got one small question before we go then. So you mentioned unintended outcome of the risk communication. Do we know anything about the mechanism behind it? Like, so communicating the risks about, as in your example, smoking and drinking,
Yeah.
Does it somehow sort of make those activities attractive to some people's mind, or do you know anything about it?
Yeah, so unintended consequences, unintended negative consequences, I should say. You can have unintended positive consequences as well. So you could mean to do something and something positive happened as well. But unintended consequences, and in particular boomerang effect, which is what those examples were, which is where the outcome is the opposite of what was intended by the risk communicated by the risk manager. There are many different reasons why risk communication fails, why risk communication has those types of effect. And I suppose that kind of links together almost everything that was said in the presentation, that it comes down to the messengers, it comes down to the audiences, it comes down to message attributes and all of the different aspects of that. In those particular examples, those two examples were taken from a book chapter in Effective Risk Communication that is on unintended consequences, and they provide, you know, each study has a different reason why the risk communication approach, risk communication had unintended consequences. So there isn't one specific answer, all encompassing. It depends on the situation, it depends on the case. I think those were cases of reactance. You know, if you look at in America, you can't drink until you're 21. So that affects students who are on campus who want to drink. So that's why they often have parties, right? They have like fraternities and sororities, so they come together. Well, if you obstruct people from drinking and you put up a sign that says don't drink, that could be very encouraging to someone who feels it's their rite of passage at university, or it's their right to be able to drink, even though they are under the age in their country, right? And so they may feel, especially if in most other countries it's not 21, it's 18. And so they may react to a risk communication message that says, hey, we think you shouldn't drink for these reasons, it's bad for you. You could, I mean, as a Brit, that you could very reasonably react to being, you know, a sort of 20-year-old who's not allowed to drink. You know, and so I think it depends on the situation. It depends on the specifics. Yeah. But the important thing is if you can evaluate your messages and your approach to risk communication beforehand in advance, then you can have a lot more information. You can really raise your chances of minimizing unintended, unwanted effects. And so, yeah, that would be the approach. Can't drink, yeah. Colonel said can't drink but can buy an AR-15. In fact, you can sign up to some bank accounts and they'll give you a free gun in some places. So it's quite awful in some places.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it's time, unfortunately. So let's thank Dominic for the interesting talk again, and thank you everyone for attending and for your contribution. I hope you have the well, you just starting a day, so have a lovely day and see you soon.
Thank you. I hope you all enjoy the sunshine. It was good to meet you all, and thank you for the thoughtful questions as well. So take care. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a nice day.